Bismillah, assalamu alaikum, and welcome back to Women's AM. This morning I'm joined by Sister Ayan, Sister Laika, and our guest this morning is Aisha Davies. Assalamu alaikum, Aisha. Welcome back on the show, and jazakallah khair for joining us once again. It's always a pleasure to have you. And last time we were on, you were on the show rather, we heard a little bit about your hijama practicing, how you trained, and you're now, mashallah, working for yourself. And obviously you have two young children as well, so I think it must be quite difficult to kind of balance the two things. So how do you make it work?
Alhamdulillah, with the studies itself, I just did that when they were in bed and on the weekends. And the actual practicing side of things, I just work around them.
Yeah.
The hours they're away from me, I don't do every single day of the week, so it's not full time for me. It just literally works around them, and that is what I state to sisters. And if I can't do the hours, then they can go somewhere else happily. It's not an issue.
So are you mobile? Are you going from place to place?
I'm actually doing a house visit tomorrow.
Oh wow.
Yeah, inshallah. So I'm booked for Thursday as well.
So you must feel like you're always kind of on the road and busy doing things.
Yeah, I really enjoy it actually. Yeah. So I really enjoy helping people.
Absolutely, I can imagine it must be really rewarding.
It is quite rewarding, so alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah, may Allah make it successful for you. Without further ado, let's go straight to her views, where today we are discussing divorce. Life can generally be stressful personally and professionally. And while most people seem to understand this as a concept, some fail to put it into practice. And this can be particularly seen when it comes to the subject of divorce. Unfortunately, we see a growing number of Muslim households going through it. And while Allah has made it permissible, the community still treat it as something that should never be done and should be avoided, even if divorce is actually the best option for the household. So how can we tackle this issue whilst keeping our deen at the forefront? As always, this is a live discussion with the panel, so do call in with any comments or questions, or send us a tweet, inshallah. Sister Aisha, I'm going to come to you first. You know, obviously, as we've said, we've discussed this many times before on the show. It's it has become a bit of a taboo, and I think that most communities have kind of moved on from the view that divorce is something to be ashamed of. But why do we still see this attitude in the Muslim community?
To be honest with you, I don't think we have completely moved away from that. I do still think, like you just mentioned, it is a taboo. I remember talking about divorce. I wanted to do a talk on it actually, and the reaction I got from the sisters was one that, like, it was almost contagious. Yeah. And I'm not joking either. So it's quite sad actually we still have this notion. I do think most communities still have the cultural norms and ideals surrounding marriage, and that they base a successful marriage on staying together. Yeah. When actually really what is success? We should remember that a successful marriage is one that should, inshallah ta'ala, draw you closer to Allah. Yeah. Yeah. So whether it fails as in ends or not, if you've come closer to Allah, surely that is a successful marriage.
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? We have to kind of remind ourselves of our purpose here on life. Yeah. It's obviously to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that may be through a variety of different roads. I think it's interesting that we always talk about the way the Muslim community talks about divorce, like it's so far removed from the way the non-Muslim community maybe talk about divorce. But do you think that's true? Do you think that the non-Muslim community have a better way of understanding or dealing with divorce, or do you think that it's still as much of a kind of stigmatized thing?
I think we have more stigma within our community, and this is just my personal opinion. I do think in some ways divorce is probably less stigmatized in the non-Muslim community, simply because it's common, especially my experience with my family members and whatnot, to get married again. Yeah. It's not that difficult necessarily to get married again if you have children and so on and so forth. So in that respect, it seems less of an issue.
Yeah. I think one of the things is that when you look at sort of the non-Muslim community, I think it's because they've all moved away from the religious views of of divorce, that's why it's seen as maybe not a norm, but it's more acceptable for something like that to happen. Whereas for us as Muslims, we've had like these ideas of divorce that are outside of Islam kind of seep in. So whether that comes in from other communities that we kind of mix with, so it could be that you're from an Asian background and you've got you come from a community where it's a mix of Muslim and Hinduism and Sikhism, and their views on divorce is quite different to the Western views, or you come from other views whereas as, you know, maybe from the Middle East or in Africa, where you mix with Christians, and even their views on divorce is different. And so some of these ideas have seeped in of why divorce is so unacceptable. And I think it's one of those things that you kind of need to step back and think, okay, what does Islam have to say about this? Because it's really not it's a non-issue in Islam. Divorce is a non-issue, and I think we've turned it into an issue because we've let other cultural beliefs and practices kind of seep into the way we practice our Islam.
Yeah. I think that's a good point. Obviously, you know, we see throughout Islamic history that divorce was something that was, you know, done a lot amongst the Sahabas, and it was, you know, it was accepted, and there was never kind of the stigma attached to it that we see today. And obviously, Allah Subhanahu wa Taala has permitted divorce in His mercy, but there's also advice within the Quran and the Sunnah as to how this should be done. So what are the kind of evidences for this, and what are the kind of you know, the references about divorce and the guidelines?
Divorce is mentioned in quite a few places actually in the Quran. In Surah Al-Baqarah, for example, Surah An-Nisa. Surah Al-Baqarah is quite clear from verse 228 to 232, for example, the how, the why, and so on and so forth. Also, I'm obviously even paraphrasing here. You know, Allah clearly states that, you know, either live with them in kindness or separate each other also in kindness. Do not hold each other in, you know, in transgress the bounds, for example. You're not supposed to transgress bounds. So I think the evidence is clear. It's just whether, I suppose, we you know, implement this within our own daily lives and our own marriages.
I think then this is like a real kind of test of our iman, of our faith, isn't it? The way we handle, you know, completely difficult situations like this. You know, do we kind of stay within the bounds of Islam, or do we, you know, let our kind of desires and nafs take over, as unfortunately we see so often when divorce happens? It gets very nasty, it gets very painful, and kind of everybody walks away. You know, nobody kind of gets out of it unscathed. Everybody gets hurt. So I think, as Ayan pointed out, I think it's really, this is a time when we have to remind ourselves of, you know, of Allah's mercy.
But even look towards the Prophet ﷺ and what he did. I mean, he made it a point to marry women from different backgrounds, and he made it a point to marry even divorcees, widows with children. And I think it goes back to show us, well, you know what, if the Rasul ﷺ, you know, married these women, why is it that we find people have an issue with it today? He didn't make an issue of it. Why are you making an issue of it?
Absolutely. And I think the thing is as well, the reality that we live in is that actually sometimes marriage is the best, divorce is the best option. You know, sometimes staying in a marriage can be, you know, detrimental. Laika, can you explain a little bit more about these situations?
So obviously each marriage is its own case, so it should be dealt with accordingly. There are many factors which should come into play. For example, facing domestic abuse, un-Islamic behaviour from a spouse, cruelty amongst family members, so maybe a mother-in-law or a brother-in-law, something like that. So if there's an unbearable living situation for not only a wife, but if there are children involved, then it becomes very important to deal with it correctly, because it could leave a psychological effect if their mother is being violently abused in the household. Do you know what I mean? And Allah says in the Quran, like, there's all, you know, Islam forbids all kind of oppression and injustice in 5:8, and also Islam teaches that God dislikes divorce, even though this hadith is da'if, but it's important to, you know, recognize it, that it can be extremely detrimental for both parties, and because both parties are left to fend for themselves. Also, as I said, children are left in an unstable living situation. It could make them uncomfortable, and it makes it, I don't want to throw this out there, but it will make it a little bit difficult to get married again, to find a suitable partner. Do you know what I mean? So I think it's really important to recognise that sometimes it's the only choice that someone has.
There are even situations where, you know, your iman becomes really shaky because of a really bad marriage, because sometimes you find spouses who will use Islam to justify, you know, the abuse and all the horrendous things that they allow to happen to them, whether it's from the spouse themselves directly or if it's from other family members. You know, they don't actually step up to the mark in trying to be just towards their wives or just to their husbands if it's coming from a wife as well. So it's just one of those things that if you feel that your iman is becoming really weak due to the situation that you're in, then that is, you know, it becomes imperative to address that issue, because your iman, your connection with Allah is of the utmost importance. The marriage takes a backbench to that.
Absolutely true. So brothers, do you agree with what's being said? We also want to hear your views, so please do call in and let us know, inshallah. Sister Aisha, I think Laika touched on an important point here about, you know, sometimes it is better to kind of get out of a marriage when it's having a detrimental effect on those that kind of within the family unit. And I think even, you know, with the children, you you know, not just in the immediate situation, but in the future, they're learning how to be a wife. They're learning what to expect from their future husbands, from what they're seeing. So, you know, what would you say about these situations when it's kind of better to walk away?
I think one, then, if that is the case, and again, going back to what we were saying about every case being absolutely individual, that would be the better option. And I absolutely totally agree. You know, subhanAllah, children are sponges. They pick up so much. They really do. They pick up so much on our behaviour, what we say, what we think. You know, we don't even have to sometimes necessarily anything, how we act. And they're also not stupid. They're very, very clued up with what's going on. They know.
More than we
they
think.
absolutely do. They really do. And it's better in the long run, once they're young, especially if they're younger, to get out of that marriage if it is, for example, abusive. I'm just giving an example, and to leave or whatever, because of the fact that you don't want your son, for example, picking up, for example, if your spouse is abusive. You do not want your son to follow in his footsteps at all. It's better to address those issues now, and rather than later on, because once that behaviour is within them, it's so much harder to rectify. So it's better to nip it in the bud sooner rather than later, I think.
No, that's absolutely true. And I think, you know, there's been a lot of studies to kind of show that this can start off a negative cycle. And you see that children that grew up with abuse, you know, end up either being abusers or, you know, themselves actually getting into abusive relationships as well. So, you know, this is something that we have to be mindful of. We talk about our example a lot. This is when it really matters.
But even within some reasons for why there are marriage breakdowns, like this is like a sort of a modern phenomenon in marriage breakdowns, is addictions, all sorts of addictions. You find that even within the Muslim community, you know, you find people are actually not taking their responsibility. They kind of leave their families on the sidelines.
We see that, and we'll come back to this point after the break. But we've had a really great discussion on this topic so far, but we are coming up to our next break. Stay where you are, and we'll return shortly to get some advice and tips from our panellists. Just before all that, it's a new week, which means a new competition. Here are the details.